Good afternoon. My name is Rick Fraumann. I cannot believe that my brother and my own son shamelessly took this moment to try to pander shamelessly that they are the best looking of this offspring. I feel confident enough that I'm not going to go down that road. I do feel like this is the first funeral I've ever attended that needs an intermission at this point. But I don't think we're going to have one. Well, there's so much I could say about my mom, and there's so much that has been said, and I heard so many stories last night, and it was such a privilege. But I just wanted to share with you a couple of characteristics and qualities that I think we all see in her, because there's not a room full of people today because she taught us something in a Bible study or because she spoke something that changed our life. It was an aha moment. She did all those things, but the reason that we're here is because she touched our heart. And when someone touches your heart, you're never the same. And none of us will be the same. And the things that she used to touch her heart were obviously love. That was one of the first things I always knew every day of my life that she loved my father. I always knew that she loved the Lord. There was never any question. I always knew that she loved me. The best example I can give you of this is when I was 15 years old and I was the oldest child, and one of my friends was 16 and he had his driver's license. And we were going to go out and have a good time. That was the first time that I was going to be in a car with someone that wasn't an adult. And I'm sure if you're a parent, you've been through that, and that's a very trying situation. So I was talking to my mom, and I said, we're going to go, and I don't even remember who it was or what we were going to do, but she said, you can go on this one condition. And she made me memorize this, and she sat me down, and she looked me in the eyes, and she said, I want you to tell him before you pull out of the driveway that you are the most important, that he is carrying the most important cargo in the world, that you're more important than all the diamonds, rubies, emeralds, millions of dollars. You're irreplaceable to me. And I said, okay. I had to practice it a couple times. She wouldn't let me out until I got it just right. So I got in the car, and we didn't do seat belts back then, I don't think. So we just looked at each other, and I said, before we go, I've got to tell you something. It's very important. He said, okay, what is it? I said, you can't back up, you can't put it in reverse, because she's promised me you couldn't put it in reverse till I tell you that you are carrying the most important cargo in the world, and that I am more important than rubies, diamonds, emeralds, and all the millions of dollars in the world. And when you carry me around today, you need to be very cognizant of this fact. And he just looked at me like I was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard in his life, and laughed, and put it in reverse, and we were gone. But I never forgot it. My mom was full of joy. She had joy. I always remember her smiling, laughing. We had a home full of laughter, home full of smiles. She did laugh at all my dad's jokes all the time. I remember on January the 10th last year, the day that cancer ravaged the bone in her leg, and it snapped, and she was in horrifying pain, and she sat down. They called 911 to come. While she was sitting there with my dad waiting for 911, she realized that it was her great-grandson's her only great-child at that time, Cadence's very first birthday. And she got on the phone and she called him and she sang happy birthday to him with a smile in her heart and a smile in her step. And she wanted to be joyful. She wanted him to know that she had joy, even though she was in the midst of her suffering. And she sat up here back in January and said in her testimony that happiness is dependent on circumstances. And sometimes she had some pretty lousy circumstances, like we all do. But joy comes from the Lord. She was a gentle person. She was very kind. I, like Greg, never remember her getting angry and yet raising her voice. I do remember her being frustrated with my younger brother at times. But he was very young and didn't know. And she would lock herself in her room, and she would come out later, and she would have a smile on her face. But she did not ever raise her voice. She never yelled at me. She never yelled at my brother. She never slammed the door. She never went on a rant and rage. I'm sure she was angry and frustrated raising two teenage boys and different times in her life. She had different times. It was a long span of her life, but she never showed that to us. She wanted her home to be one of peace, and she told us that many times. She made an intentional effort for it to be filled with peace. And when we think of her, I don't think of her as someone running around that's hectic. I think of her smiling, peaceful, laughing, loving. I do remember those days, and I don't think it was just your blue jeans. I remember your underwear and your socks were all toasty warm because she didn't want Greg to be cold at the bus stop. I don't remember those days with me, but I do remember them with Greg. And I remember him smiling when you put your leg out like that. But she was thoughtful and caring and things of those natures. And you all have your own stories. And our stories are not different or better. We just happen to have the microphone to share it with you, ours. But what I want to say today is those things that we saw in my mom's life, of all the characteristics that I want to take away from her life, there's one characteristic that rides above all of those things. And that is when she was 12 years old. You all know her story if you spent any time with her. She lay in a hospital bed in isolation with polio. No one could see her except her mom or dad, and they were in white, dressed, and everything was closed down. She couldn't see her friends. She was taken out of school. She laid there. And polio doesn't sound like much today, but it was a death sentence then. And no one knew how it was transmitted. They didn't know what the cure was. They didn't know what it was, so they just put you away. It was sort of like leprosy in the New Testament times. And as she lay there, a scared little girl at 12 years old, looking up into the ceiling, into the darkness, she heard the doctor tell her mother and father, she'll never walk. She'll never have children. She'll never lead a normal life. And you know her story, and she gave her life to the Lord that night, and she said, I hope you can give these things to me. I want these things, and I will follow you all the days of her life. And the characteristic I admire the most about her is that she did follow the Lord all the days of her life. There's a lot of us that start down that path, and 3 days later we say, this God thing is not working out. Or 3 weeks later, or 3 months later, or 3 years later. And we say, we tried that, it's not really there. And that's a common story in our world today. But you know, she didn't. She celebrated her 75th birthday right before she passed away. So for 63 years, she hung on to Jesus, and she wanted more of him. And she got more of him. He's faithful, and he gave her more of him. And I've heard people say things, and I really appreciate what you're saying when you say it, because I know your heart. I've heard people say, she was an angel. I've heard people say they broke the mold when they made your mother. I've heard people say there's nobody I've ever met like her. And while I think much of that is true, I think if she was here, she would say, don't put me on a pedestal. I'm not any different than you or anyone else. What was different about her is that we all do have a mold, and it's full of us. And she spent her life pouring herself out of that mold and asking God to give her more. And he gave her more, and he filled her. And like Joe said, she kept it and she gave it away. And she kept doing that. I have a unique privilege of seeing 52 years of doing that. I saw what she did when I was 2 years old and 5 years old and 8 years old. And she had a stage. She was beautiful. She was stunning. She had a phenomenal voice. She had a platform. She had a spotlight in a large church. She had a spotlight in business. She spoke before thousands of people. And I thought, that's the way you influence people for God, is you're successful and you have it together and you have beauty and you have it together and you have wealth and you have power and you can show people that this is what God has done in your life and they're going to want that. And you know, all that's true. The last 10 years of her life, she didn't have that. It was all savagely taken away from her. She lost her hair, she lost her leg, she lost her voice, she lost the stage, she lost the spotlight. She doesn't speak in front of hundreds of people. But the stories that I heard over and over these last 2 weeks, she impacted 10 times more people in the last 10 years of her life through her struggle for a number of reasons. First of all, we can't all relate to that success, but we can all relate to struggle. We certainly can. And in that struggle, not only was she struggling, then she had a lifetime of living with the Lord. Like my son said, she planted her roots firmly. And as she poured her life out and she begged for more of him, and if you know her, she never was prideful of what she knew or what she'd experienced. She wanted more. She wanted to learn more. She wanted to experience more. She wanted more of God's power, more of his love, more of his knowledge, more of everything, not to hoard it up inside of her, but to give it away. And it reminds me of the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians, because all the things I mentioned to you that are qualities and characteristics that I admire and that we admire in my mother's life, Paul talks about them in Galatians 5, and he says the fruits of the Spirit are love, and it's joy, and it's peace, it's patience. There's kindness, there's gentleness, there's thoughtfulness, and there's self-control. And all of those things that I said, that was what my mother experienced. And she would tell you today that they didn't come from herself. She would tell you that she tried to have them come from herself, just like we all do, and it's not there. But what she did is she spent 63 years chasing after Jesus, fulfilling what her promise to God is. I hope you do these things in my life, but if regardless, I'm going to follow you all the days of her life. The cry of a desperate 12-year-old girl. And that fruit of the Spirit, we plant a seed and we try to dig it up a week later and there's nothing. And we say, well, I guess this seed stuff doesn't work. But after years and years and decades, it developed into a vineyard in her life. And fruit, you can go grab it and you pull it off the vine and you taste it and you bite into it. And it's sweet and it's nourishing and it gives you life. And that's what she showed us, to taste and see that the Lord is good. And all those qualities and characteristics that we admired in her were the fruit of the Holy Spirit being invested and grown through an entire lifetime. And if there's something for us to take from that today, I would challenge us all. It certainly challenges me to hold on and be faithful and true. And that's her side of the story. Now, she has a partner in my dad. But before that, she entered into a partnership, into a covenant with the Lord Jesus Christ when she was 12 years old. And you know what? She did everything in her power to fulfill what she promised him. And she didn't walk the next day. She didn't walk a week later. She didn't walk a month later. I wonder if God is active in my life. I wonder if it meant anything. Her cousin Shirley talked to me last night. She was at the funeral home, and she said, I was there that day in church when your mother walked. I remember that. We looked through old scrapbooks, and it said, the newspaper actually covered that then. That was a story that was newsworthy. I'm sure the Atlanta Journal would not cover it today, or the Marietta Daily Journal. But the Columbus paper covered it and said, New Legs on Easter. And God, Jesus, who is extravagant, she found him, and I want to tell you that he is a hilarious, extravagant giver. And if you ever doubt that, think of the story of my mom. As Greg pointed out, he paid the price for our sin. And it's as like we owe $1 million. Put it in the context that we understand it. We only have 100, and there's no way we can pay it. And he sent his best. He sent his only son, the best that he had, that was more valuable to him than rubies, diamonds, emeralds, and all of the money in the world. And he gave the very best he had for my mother and for each one of us. And that son was beaten beyond recognition to pay the price for us, so that he overpaid. That's what he does. He didn't pay $1 million and put it in our account. He paid $100 million. So if you ever doubt for 1 minute that, You don't understand. I'm not like Jan Fraumann. He could never forgive me. Not only did he pay for your sin, but there's a credit balance that far exceeds many times of what you could ever do. And that's what he did in his partnership with my mom. With my mom. She asked to walk, and she didn't walk right away, but you know what? She walked. She walked many, many years. In the last 10 years of her life, when she had 8 surgeries and she had cancer ravaging a leg, and she had an amputation of a leg, it wasn't in the leg that had polio. It was in the other leg. He gave her not only the chance to walk, but he walked past the legs that she already had. He extravagantly gave her more. And when I was in the hospital room, when she woke up after she lost that leg, and she was learning to transition from one leg from a bed to a wheelchair, and a wheelchair to a car, and she was struggling, that leg that had polio was the one that held her up for the last 2 years of her life and gave her strength. And she asked for a child. And I think that's why she loved me so much. It was nothing I did. I did nothing. But what I was the very first part, and Greg was the next part of the fulfillment of her longing and her dream and her prayer, please give me children. And she did. And on January 2nd of this year, when she was in Austin at our house, Nate and Brittany birthed her 3rd great-grandchild, Jonathan Robert. And she was there in the hospital and got to hold him about an hour afterwards. And Cadence and Michaela were there, and all 3 of her great-grandchildren were there. And I remember as she held Michaela, that little girl, she just wept with tears of joy. I said, Mom, what's wrong? And she said, I can't explain it. There are no words. I cannot describe to you. I cannot tell you the joy that I have. I never thought I would see this moment, to see this far. I hoped for children, and I thought about grandchildren, and I never thought God would be so gracious and so merciful and so awesome to let me see this in my life. And he did. And I think he was just laughing with tears of joy because she bargained for something and he gave her so much more. The last thing I'll tell you, and I'm sorry, she prayed for Greg and I to have a tender heart, so I can't help it. She prayed for this. The last thing that she prayed for and hoped for was a normal life. And I've been to a lot of funerals, and usually there's 5 people there. There's not a full house, standing room only at someone's funeral. And she had anything but a normal life. God gave her an extraordinary life, a life filled with meaning and purpose and power and difference. And she touched people's lives, and she made a difference in their lives. And I've heard many of the stories. She never had a normal life because he is so big, and he is so powerful, and he is so good, and he is so extravagant that she didn't realize. You don't realize it in a day, and you don't realize it in a year. You only realize it when you look back and you have a chance to reflect. And she would tell me to tell you today, she wasn't anything unique or special. She was a little girl that was desperate for God, and she held on to him. And she was faithful all the days of her life, and she could not believe how much he loved her and how extravagant his love and his blessings were to her. And I know that she is with him. She's looking into his face, and she is overcome because she thought she made a great hard bargain when she was a little girl. And she had no idea what she was getting into. And Mom, as you look into the face of Jesus and you're filled with his joy, we all know, and we're all here to tell you that you were very loved. And we love you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sorry this is a long celebration, but I planned it, and you can blame me later. Have a seat, please. I only had one crack at this to share with you the life of my sweetie. And you see it in my family. I want to settle this issue about handsomeness.